Chapter 15 of A Fighting Man of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15 The Battle of Jahar. Glancing across my shoulder, I saw that the two circling to our rear were already further away from us than he who stood facing us, and realizing that the unexpectedness of our act would greatly enhance the chances of success, I gave the word. "Now, Tavia," I whispered, and together we leaped forward at a run straight for the naked savage facing us. It was evident that he had not expected this, and it was also evident that he was a slow-witted beast, for as he saw us coming his lower jaw dropped and he just stood there, waiting to receive us. Whereas, if he had had any intelligence, he would have fallen back to give his fellows time to attack us from the rear. As our swords crossed, I heard a savage growl from behind, such a growl as might issue from the throat of a wild beast. From the corner of my eye, I saw Tavia glance back. And then, before I could realize what she intended, she sprang forward and ran her sword through the body of the man in front of me as he lunged at me with his own weapon, and now, wheeling together, we faced the other two who were running rapidly toward us, and I can assure you that it was with a feeling of infinite relief that I realized that the odds were no longer so greatly against us. As the two engaged us, I was handicapped at first by the necessity of constantly keeping an eye on Tavia, but not for long. In an instant I realized that a master hand was wielding that blade. Its point wove in and out past the clumsy guard of the savage, and I knew, and I guessed he must have sensed, that his life lay in the hollow of the little hand that gripped the hilt. Then I turned my attention to my own antagonist. These were not the best swordsmen that I have ever met, but they were far from being poor swordsmen. Their defense, however, far excelled their offense, and this, I think, was due to two things: natural cowardice and the fact that they usually hunted in packs, which far outnumbered the quarry. Thus a good defense only was required, since the death blow might always be struck from behind by a companion of the one who engaged the quarry from in front. Never before had I seen a woman fight, and I should have thought that I should have been chagrined to have one fighting at my side, but instead I felt a strange thrill that was partly pride and partly something else that I could not analyze. At first, I think, the fellow facing Tavia did not realize that she was a woman, but he must have soon, as the scant harness of Barsoom hides little, and certainly did not hide the rounded contours of Tavia's girlish body. Perhaps, therefore, it was surprise that was his undoing, or possibly, when he discovered her sex, he became overconfident, but at any rate, Tavia slipped her point into his heart just an instant before I finished my man. I cannot say that we were greatly elated over our victory. Each of us felt compassion for the poor creatures who had been reduced to their horrid state by the tyranny of cruel Tal Akstar, but it had been their lives or ours, and we were glad that it had not been ours. As a matter of precaution, I took a quick look about us as the last of our antagonists fell, and I was glad that I had, for I immediately discerned three creatures crouching at the top of a low hill not far distant. "We're not done yet, Tavia," I said. "Look," and pointed in the direction of the three. "Perhaps they do not care to share the fate of their fellows," she said. "They are not approaching." "They can have peace if they want it, as far as I am concerned," I said. "Come, let us go on. If they follow us, then will be time enough to consider them." As we walked on toward the north, we glanced back occasionally, and presently we saw the three rise and come down the hill toward the bodies of their slain fellows, and as they did so we saw that they were women and that they were unarmed. When they realized that we were departing and had no intention of attacking them, they broke into a run, and uttering loud, uncanny shrieks, raced madly toward the corpses. "How pathetic," said Tavia sadly. "Even these poor degraded creatures possess human emotions. They too can feel sorry at the loss of loved ones." "Yes," I said. "Poor things, I am sorry for them." Fearing that in the frenzy of their grief they might attempt to avenge their fallen mates, we kept a close eye upon them, or we might not have witnessed the horrid sequel of the fray. I wish that we had not. When the three women reached the corpses, they fell upon them, but not with weeping and lamentation. They fell upon them to devour them. Sickened, we turned away and walked rapidly toward the north, until long after darkness had descended. We felt that there was little danger of attack at night, since there were no savage beasts in a country where there was nothing to support them, and also that it was reasonable to assume that the hunting men would be abroad by day rather than by night, since at night they would be far less able to find quarry or follow it. I suggested to Tavia that we rest for a short time and then push on for the balance of the night, find a place of concealment early in the day, and remain there until night had fallen again, as I was sure that if we followed this plan we would make better time and suffer less exhaustion by traveling through the cool hours of darkness, and at the same time would greatly minimize the danger of discovery and attack by whatever hostile people lay between us and Gathol. Tavia agreed with me, and so we rested for a short time, taking turns at sleeping and watching. Later we pushed on, and I am sure that we covered a great distance before dawn, though the high hills to the north of us still looked as far away as they had upon the previous day. We now set about searching for some comfortable place of concealment where we might spend the daylight hours. Neither of us was suffering to any extent from either hunger or thirst, as the ancients would have done under like circumstances, for with the gradual diminution of water and vegetable matter upon Mars during countless ages, all her creatures have by a slow process of evolution been enabled to go for long periods without either food or drink, and we have also learned so to control our minds that we do not think of food or drink until we are able to procure it, which doubtless greatly assists us in controlling the cravings of our appetite. After considerable search we found a deep and narrow ravine, which seemed a most favorable place in which to hide, but scarcely had we entered it when I chanced to see two eyes looking down upon us from the summit of one of the ridges that flanked it. As I looked, the head in which the eyes were set was withdrawn below the summit. "That puts an end to this place," I said to Tavia, telling her what I had seen. "We must move on and look for a new sanctuary." As we emerged from the ravine at its upper end, I glanced back, and again I saw the creature looking at us, and once again he tried to hide himself from us. As we moved on, I kept glancing back, and occasionally I would see him, one of the hunting men of Ugor. He was stalking us as the wild beast stalks its prey. The very thought of it filled me with disgust. Had he been a fighting man stalking us merely to kill, I should not have felt as I did. But the thought that he was stealthily trailing us because he desired to devour us was repellent. It was horrifying. Hour after hour, the thing kept upon our trail. Doubtless he feared to attack because we outnumbered him, or perhaps he thought we might become separated, or lie down to sleep, or do one of the number of things that travelers might do that would give him the opportunity he sought. But after a while he must have given up hope. He no longer sought to conceal himself from us, and once, as he mounted a low hill, he stood there silhouetted against the sky, and throwing his head back, he gave voice to a shrill, uncanny cry that made the short hairs upon my neck stand erect. It was the hunting cry of the wild beast calling the pack to the kill. I could feel Tavia shudder and press more closely to me, and I put my arm about her in a gesture of protection, and thus we walked on in silence for a long time. Twice again the creature voiced his uncanny cry, until at last it was answered ahead of us and to the right. Again we were forced to fight, but this time only two, and when we pushed on again it was with a feeling of depression that I could not shake off. Depression for the utter hopelessness of our situation. At the summit of a higher hill than we had before crossed, I halted. Some tall weeds grew there. "Let us lie down here, Tavia," I said. "From here we can watch. Let us be the watchers for a while. Sleep, and when night comes, we shall move on." She looked tired, and that worried me, but I think she was suffering more from the nervous strain of the eternal stalking than from physical fatigue. I know that it affected me, and how much more might it affect a young girl than a trained fighting man? She lay very close to me, as though she felt safer thus and was soon asleep, while I watched. From this high vantage point I could see a considerable area of the country about us, and it was not long before I detected figures of men prowling about like hunting bants, and often it was apparent that one was stalking another. There were at least a half a dozen such visible to me at one time. I saw one overtake his prey and leap upon it from behind. They were at too great a distance from me for me to discern accurately the details of the encounter, but I judged that the stalker ran his sword through the back of his quarry, and then, like a hunting bant, he fell upon his kill and devoured it. I do not know that he finished it, but he was still eating when darkness fell. Tavia had had a long sleep, and when she awoke she reproached me for having permitted her to sleep so long and insisted that I must sleep. From necessity, I have learned to do with little sleep when conditions are such that I cannot spare the time, though I always make up for it later, and I have also learned to limit my sleep to any length of time that I choose, so that now I awoke promptly when my allotted time had elapsed, and again we set out toward Far Gathol. Again this night, as upon the preceding one, we moved unmolested through the horrid land of Ugor, and when morning dawned we saw the high hills rising close before us. "Perhaps these hills mark the northern limits of Ugor," I suggested. "I think they do," replied Tavia. "They are only a short distance away now," I said. "Let us keep on until we have passed them. I cannot leave this accursed land behind me too soon." "Nor I," said Tavia. "I sicken at the thought of what I have seen." We had crossed a narrow valley and were entering the hills when we heard the hateful hunting cry behind us. Turning, I saw a single man moving across the valley toward us. He knew that I had seen him, but he kept steadily on, occasionally stopping to voice his weird scream. He heard an answer come from the east, and then another and another from different directions. We hastened onward, climbing the low foothills that led upward toward the summit far above, and as we looked back we saw the hunting men converging upon us from all sides. We had never seen so many of them at one time before. "Perhaps if we get well up into the mountains we can elude them," I said. Tavia shook her head. "At least we have made a good fight, Hadron," she said. I saw that she was discouraged, nor could I wonder. Yet a moment later she looked up at me and smiled brightly. "We still live, Hadron of Hastor," she exclaimed. "We still live, and we have our swords," I reminded her. As we climbed, they pressed upward behind us, and presently I saw others coming through the hills from the right and from the left. We returned from the low saddle over which I had hoped to cross the summit of the range, for hunting men had entered it from above and were coming down toward us. Directly ahead of us now loomed a high peak, the highest in the range as far as I could see, and only there, up its steep side, were there no hunting men to bar our way. As we climbed, the sides of the mountain grew steeper, until the ascent was not only most arduous, but sometimes difficult and dangerous. Yet there was no alternative, and we pressed onward toward the summit, while behind us came the hunting men of Ugor. They were not rushing us, and from that I felt confident that they knew that they had us cornered. I was looking for a place in which we might make a stand, but I found none, and at last we reached the summit, a circular, level space perhaps 100 feet in diameter. As our pursuers were yet some little distance below us, I walked quickly around the outside of the table-like top of the peak. The entire northern face dropped sheer from the summit for a couple of 100 feet, definitely blocking our retreat. At every other point the hunting men were ascending. Our situation appeared hopeless. It was hopeless, and yet I refused to admit defeat. The summit of the mountain was strewn with loose rock. I hurled a rock down at the nearest cannibal. It struck him upon the head and sent him hurtling down the mountainside, carrying a couple of his fellows with him. Then Tavia followed my example, and together we bombarded them. But more often we scored misses than hits, and there were so many of them, and they were so fierce and so hungry, that we did not even stem their advance. So numerous were they now that they reminded me of insects, crawling up there from below, huge grotesque insects that would soon fall upon us and devour us. As they came nearer, they gave voice to a new cry that I had not heard before. It was a cry that differed from the hunting call, but was equally as terrible. "Their war cry," said Tavia. On and on, with relentless persistency, the throng swarmed upward toward us. We drew our swords. It was our last stand. Tavia pressed closer to me, and for the first time I thought I felt her tremble. "Do not let them take me," she said. "It is not death that I fear." I knew what she meant, and I took her in my arms. "I cannot do it, Tavia," I said. "I cannot." "You must," she replied in a firm voice. "If you care for me even as a friend, you cannot let these beasts take me alive." I know that I choked then, so that I could not reply, but I knew that she was right, and I drew my dagger. "Goodbye, Hadron, my Hadron." Her breast was bared to receive my dagger. Her face was upturned toward mine. It was still a brave face, with no fear upon it, and oh, how beautiful it was. Impulsively, guided by a power I could not control, I bent and crushed my lips to hers. With half-closed eyes, she pressed her own lips upward more tightly against mine. "Oh, Isis," she breathed as she took them away, and then, "They come. Strike now, Hadron, and strike deep." The creatures were almost at the summit. I swung my hand upward that I might bury the slim dagger deeply in that perfect breast. To my surprise, my knuckles struck something hard above me. I glanced upward. There was nothing there. Yet something impelled me to feel again, to solve that uncanny mystery even in that instant of high tragedy. Again I felt above me. By Isis, there was something there. My fingers passed over a smooth surface, a familiar surface. It could not be, and yet I knew that it must be. The Jama. I asked no questions of myself nor of fate at that instant. The hunting men of Ugor were almost upon us as my groping fingers found one of the mooring rings in the bow of the Jama. Quickly I swung Tavia above my head. "It is the Jama! Climb to her deck!" I cried. The dear girl, as quick to seize upon the fortuitous opportunities as any trained fighting man, did not pause to question, but swung herself upward to the deck with the agility of an athlete. And as I seized the mooring ring and drew myself upward, she lay flat upon her belly and, reaching down, assisted me, nor was the strength in that slender frame unequal to the task. The leaders of the horde had reached the summit. They paused in momentary confusion when they saw us climb into thin air and stand there apparently just above their heads. But hunger urged them on, and they leaped for us, clambering upon one another's back and shoulders to seize us and drag us down. Two almost gained the deck as I fought them all back single-handed, while Tavia had raised a hatch and leaped to the controls. Another foul-faced thing reached the deck upon the opposite side, and only chance revealed him to me before he had run his sword through my back. The Jama was already rising, and I turned to engage him. There was little room there in which to fight, but I had the advantage in that I knew the extent of the deck beneath my feet, while he could see nothing but thin air. I think it frightened him too, and when I rushed him, he stepped backward out into space, and with a scream of terror hurtled downward toward the ground. We were saved. But how in the name of all our ancestors had the Jama chanced to be at this spot? Perhaps Tall Axtar was aboard. The thought filled me with alarm for Tavia's safety, and with my sword ready, I leaped through the hatchway into the cabin, but only Tavia was there. We tried to arrive at some explanation of the miracle that had saved us, but no amount of conjecture brought forth anything that was at all satisfactory. "She was there when we needed her most," said Tavia. "That fact should satisfy us." "I guess it will have to for the time being, at least," I said. "And now, once more, we can turn a ship's nose toward Helium." We had passed but a short distance beyond the mountains when I sighted a ship in the distance, and shortly thereafter another and another, until I was aware that we were approaching a great fleet moving toward the east. As we came closer, I descried the hulls painted with the ghastly blue of Jahar, and I knew that this was Tul Akstar's formidable armada. And then we saw ships approaching from the east, and I knew that it was the fleet of Helium. It could be no other. Yet I must make certain, and so I sped in the direction of the nearest ship of this other fleet until I saw the banners and pennons of Helium floating from her upper works, and the battle insignia of the warlord painted upon her prow. Behind her came the other ships, a noble fleet moving to inevitable doom. A Jaharian cruiser was moving toward the first great battleship as I raced to intercept them and bring one of my rifles into action. I was forced to come close to my target, as was the Jaharian cruiser, since the effective range of the disintegrating ray rifle is extremely limited. Everything aboard the battleship of Helium was ready for action, but I knew why they had not fired a gun. It has ever been the boast of John Carter, warlord of Barsoom, that he would not start a war. The enemy must fire the first shot. If I could have reached them in time, he would have realized the fatal consequences of this magnanimous and chivalrous code, and the ships of Helium, with their long-range guns, might have annihilated Jahar's entire fleet before it could have brought its deadly rifles within range. But fate had ordained otherwise, and now the best that I could hope was that I might reach the Jaharian ship before it was too late. Tavia was at the controls. We were racing toward the blue cruiser of Jahar. I was standing at the forward rifle. In another moment we should be within range, and then I saw the great battleship of Helium crumble in mid-air. Its wooden parts dropped slowly toward the ground, and 1,000 warriors plunged to a cruel death upon the barren land beneath. Almost immediately the other ships of Helium were brought to a stop. They had witnessed the catastrophe that had engulfed the first ship of the line, and the commander of the fleet had realized that they were menaced by a new force of which they had no knowledge. The ships of Tul Akstar, encouraged by this first success, were now moving swiftly to the attack. The cruiser that had destroyed the great battleship was in the lead, but now I was within range of it. Realizing that the blue protective paint of Jahar would safeguard the ship itself against the disintegrating ray, I had rammed home a cartridge of another type in the chamber, and swinging the muzzle of the rifle so that it would rake the entire length of the ship, I pressed the button. Instantly the men upon the deck dissolved into thin air. Only their harness and their metal and their weapons were left. Directing Tavia to run the Jama alongside, I raised the upper hatch and leaped to the deck of the cruiser, and a moment later I had raised the signal of surrender above her. One can imagine the consternation aboard the nearer ships of Jahar as they saw that signal flying from her forward mast, for there were none sufficiently close to have witnessed what actually transpired aboard her. Returning to the cabin of the Jama, I lowered the hatch and went at once to the periscope. Far in the rear of the first line of Jaharian ships, I could just discern the royal insignia upon a great battleship, which told me that Tul Akstar was there, but in a safe position. I should have liked to reach his ship next, but the fleet was moving forward toward the ships of Helium, and I dared not spare the time. By now the ships of Helium had opened fire, and shells were exploding about the leading ships of the Jaharian fleet. Shells so nicely timed that they could be set to explode at any point up to the extreme range of the gun that discharges them. It takes nice gunnery to synchronize the timing with the target. As ship after ship of the Jaharian fleet was hit, the others brought their big guns into action. Temporarily, at least, the disintegrating ray rifles had failed, but that they would succeed I knew if a single ship could get through the heliometic line, where among the great battleships she could destroy a dozen in the space of a few minutes. The gunnery of the Jaharians was poor. Their shells usually exploded high in the air before they reached their target, but as the battle continued it improved. Yet I knew that Jahar never could hope to defeat Helium with Helium's own weapons. A great battleship of Tul-Akstar's fleet was hit 3 times in succession almost alongside of me. I saw her drop by the stern, and I knew that she was done for. And then I saw her commander rush to the bow and take the last long dive, and I knew that there were brave men in Tul-Akstar's fleet as well as in the fleet of Helium. But Tul-Akstar was not one of them, for in the distance I could see his flagship racing toward Jahar. Despite the cowardice of the Jeddak, the great fleet pushed on to the attack. If they had the courage, they could still win, for their ships outnumbered the ships of Helium 10-1, and as far as the eye could reach, I could see them speeding from the north, from the south, and from the west toward the scene of battle. Closer and closer the ships of Helium were pressing toward the ships of Jahar. In his ignorance, the warlord was playing directly into the hands of the enemy. With their superior marksmanship and 20 battleships protected by the blue paint of Jahar, Helium could wipe out Tul-Akstar's great armada. Of that I was confident. And with that thought came an inspiration. It might be done, and only 10 Hadron of Hastor could do it. Shells were falling all about us. The force of the explosions rocked the Jama until she tossed and pitched like an ancient ship upon an ancient sea. Again and again were we perilously close to the line of fire of the Jaharian disintegrating ray rifles. I felt that I might no longer risk Tavia thus, yet I must carry out the plan that I had conceived. It is strange how men change, and for what seemingly trivial reasons. I had thought all my life that I would make any sacrifice for Helium, but now I knew that I would not sacrifice a single hair of that tousled head for all Barsoom. This, I soliloquized, is friendship. Taking the controls, I turned the bow of the Jama toward one of the ships of Helium that was standing temporarily out of the line of fire, and as we approached her side, I turned the controls back over to Tavia, and raising the forward hatch, sprang to the deck of the Jama, raising both hands above my head in a signal of surrender in the event that they might take me for a Jaharian. What must they have thought when they saw me apparently floating upright upon thin air? That they were astonished was evident by the expressions on the faces of those nearest to me as the Jama touched the side of the battleship. They kept me covered as I came aboard, leaving Tavia to maneuver the Jama. Before I could announce myself, I was recognized by a young officer of my own umak. With a cry of surprise he leaped forward and threw his arms about me. "Hadron of Hastor!" he cried. "Have I witnessed your resurrection from death? But no, you are too real, too much alive to be any wraith of the other world." "I am alive now," I cried, "but none of us will be unless I can get word to your commander. Where is he?" "Here," said a voice behind me, and I turned to see an old Adwar who had been a great friend of my father's. He recognized me immediately, but there was no time even for greetings. "Warn the fleet that the ships of Jahar are armed with disintegrating ray rifles that can dissolve every ship as you saw the first one dissolve. They are only effective at short range. Keep at least a hod distance from them and you are relatively safe. And now, if you will give me 3 men and direct the fire of your fleet away from the Jaharian ships on the south of their line, I will agree to have 20 ships for you in an hour, ships protected by the blue of Jahar in which you may face their disintegrating ray rifles with impunity." The Adwar knew me well, and upon his own responsibility, he agreed to do what I asked. 3 Padwars of my own class guaranteed to accompany me. I fetched Tavia aboard the battleship and turned her over to the protection of the old Adwar, though she objected strenuously to being parted from me. "We have gone through so much together, Hadron of Hastor," she said. "Let us go on to the end together." She had come quite close to me and spoken in a low voice that none might overhear. Her eyes, filled with pleading, were upturned to mine. "I cannot risk you further, Tavia," I said. "There is so much danger, then, you think?" she asked. "We shall be in danger, of course," I said. "This is war, and one can never tell. Do not worry, though. I shall come back safely." "Then it is that you fear that I shall be in the way," she said, "and another can do the work better than I?" "Of course not," I replied. "I am thinking only of your safety." "If you are lost, I shall not live. I swear it," she said. "So if you can trust me to do the work of a man, let me go with you instead of one of those." I hesitated. "Oh, Hadron of Hastor, please do not leave me here without you," she said. I could not resist her. "Very well, then," I said. "Come with me. I would rather have you than any other." And so it was that Tavia replaced one of the padwars on the Jama, much to the officer's chagrin. Before entering the Jama, I turned again to the old Adwar. "If we are successful," I said, "a number of Tul Akstar's battleships will move slowly toward the Helium line beneath signals of surrender. Their crews will have been destroyed. Have boarding parties ready to take them over." Naturally, everyone aboard the battleship was intensely interested in the Jama, though all that they could see of her was the open hatch and the eye of the periscope. Officers and men lined the rail as we went aboard our invisible craft, and as I closed the hatch, a loud cheer rang out above me. My first act thoroughly evidenced my need of Tavia, for I put her at the after turret in charge of the rifle there, while one of the padwars took the controls and turned the prow of the Jama toward the Jaharian fleet. I was standing in a position where I could watch the changing scene upon the ground glass beneath the periscope, and when a great battleship swung slowly into the miniature picture before me, I directed the padwar to lay a straight course for her, but a moment later I saw another battleship moving abreast of her. This was better, and we changed our course to pass between the two. They were moving gallantly toward the fleet of Helium, firing their big guns now and reserving their disintegrating ray rifles for closer range. What a magnificent sight they were, and yet how helpless. The tiny, invisible Jama, with her little rifles, constituted a greater menace to them than did the entire fleet of Helium. On they drove, unconscious of the inevitable fate bearing down upon them. "Sweep the starboard ship from stern to stern," I called to Tavia. "I will take this fellow on our port." And then to the padwar at the controls, "Half speed!" Slowly we passed their bows. I touched the button upon my rifle, and through the tiny sighting aperture I saw the crew dissolve in the path of those awful rays, as the two ships passed. We were very close, so close that I could see the expressions of consternation and horror on the faces of some of the warriors as they saw their fellows disappear before their eyes, and then their turn would come, and they would be snuffed out in the twinkling of an eye, their weapons and their metal clattering to the deck. As we dropped astern of them, our work completed, I had the padwar bring the Jama about and alongside one of the ships which I quickly boarded, running up the signal of surrender. With the death of the officer at her controls, she had fallen off with the wind, but I quickly brought her up again, and setting her at half speed, her bow toward the ships of Helium, I locked the controls and left her. Returning to the Jama, we crossed quickly to the other ship, and a few moments later it too was moving slowly toward the fleet of the warlord, the signal of surrender fluttering above it. So quickly had the blow been struck that even the nearer ships of Jahar were some time in realizing that anything was amiss. Perhaps they were unable to believe their own eyes when they saw two of their great battleships surrender before having been struck by a single shot. But presently the commander of a light cruiser seemed to awaken to the seriousness of the situation, even though he could not fully have understood it. We were already moving toward another battleship when I saw the cruiser speeding directly toward one of our prizes, and I knew that it would never reach the fleet of Helium if he boarded it, a thing which I must prevent at all costs. His course would bring him across our bow, and as he passed I raked him with the forward rifle. I saw that it would be impossible for Jama to overtake this swift cruiser, which was moving at full speed, and so we had to let her go her way. At first, I was afraid she would ram the nearer prize, and had she hit her squarely at the rate that she was traveling, the cruiser would have plowed halfway through the hull of the battleship. Fortunately, she missed the great ship by a hair, and went speeding on into the midst of the fleet of Helium. Instantly, she was the target for 100 guns. A barrage of shells was bursting about her, and then there must have been a dozen hits simultaneously, for the cruiser simply disappeared, a mass of flying debris. As I turned back to our work, I saw the havoc being wrought by the big guns of Helium upon the enemy ships to the north of me. In the instant that I glanced, I saw 3 great battleships take the final dive, while at least 4 others were drifting helplessly with the wind, but other ships of that mighty armada were swinging into action. As far as I could see, they were coming from the north, from the south, and from the west. There seemed no end of them, and now at last I realized that only a miracle could give victory to Helium. In accordance with my suggestion, our fleet was holding off, concentrating the fire of its big guns upon the nearer ship of Jahar, constantly seeking to keep those deadly rifles out of range. Again we fell to work, to the grim work that the god of battle had allotted to us. One by one, 20 great battleships surrendered their deserted decks to us, and as we worked I counted fully as many more destroyed by the guns of the warlord. In the prosecution of our work, we had been compelled to destroy at least half a dozen small craft, such as scout flyers and light cruisers, and now these were racing erratically among the remaining ships of the Jaharian fleet, carrying consternation and doubtless terror to the hearts of Tal Akstar's warriors, for all the nearer ships must have realized long since that some strange new force had been loosed upon them by the ships of Helium. By this time we had worked so far behind the Jaharian first line that we could no longer see the ships of Helium, though bursting shells attested the fact that they were still there. From past experience, I realized that it would be necessary to protect the captured Jaharian ships from being retaken, and so I turned back, taking a position where I could watch as many of them as possible, and it was well that I did so, for we found it necessary to destroy the crews of 3 more ships before we reached the battle line of Helium. Here they had already manned a dozen of the captured battleships of Jahar, and with the banners and pennons of Helium above them, they had turned about and were moving into action against their sister ships. It was then that the spirit of Jahar was broken. This, I think, was too much for them, as doubtless the majority of them believed that these ships had gone over to the enemy voluntarily with all their officers and crews, for few, if any, could have known that the latter had been destroyed. Their Jeddak had long since deserted them. 20 of their largest ships had gone over to the enemy, and now, protected by the blue of Jahar and manned by the best gunners of Barsoom, were plowing through them, spreading death and destruction upon every hand. A dozen of Tal Akstar's ships surrendered voluntarily, and then the others turned and scattered. Very few of them headed toward Jahar, and I knew by that they believed that the city must inevitably fall. The warlord made no effort to pursue the fleeing craft. Instead, he stationed the ships that we captured from the enemy, more than 30 all told now, entirely around the fleet of Helium, to protect it from the disintegrating ray rifles of the enemy in the event of a renewed attack, and then, slowly, we moved on Jahar. End of Chapter 15. Chapter 16 of A Fighting Man of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Despair. Immediately after the close of the battle, the warlord sent for me, and a few moments later Tavia and I stepped aboard the flagship. The warlord himself came forward to meet us. "I knew," he said, "that the son of Had-Urter would give a good account of himself. Helium can scarcely pay the debt of gratitude that you have placed upon her today. You have been to Jahar. Your work today convinces me of that. May we with safety approach and take the city?" "No," I replied, and then briefly I explained the mighty force that Tul Akstar had gathered, and the armament with which he expected to subdue the world. "But there is a way," I said. "And what is that?" he asked. "Send one of the captured Jaharian ships with a flag of truce, and I believe that Tul Akstar will surrender. He is a coward. He fled in terror when the battle was still young." "Will he honor a flag of truce?" "If it is carried aboard one of his own ships, protected by the blue paint of Jahar, I believe that he will," I said. "But at the same time, I shall accompany the ship in the invisible Jama. I know how I may gain entrance to the palace. I have abducted Tul Akstar once, and perchance I may be able to do it again. If you have him in your hands, you can dictate terms to the nobles, all of whom fear the terrific power of the hungry multitude that is held in check now only by the instinctive terror they feel for their Jeddak." As we waited for the former Jaharian cruiser that was to carry the flag of truce to come alongside, John Carter told me what had delayed the expedition against Jahar for so many months. The major domo of Tor Hatan's palace, to whom I had entrusted the message to John Carter, and which would have led immediately to the descent upon Jahar, had been assassinated while on his way to the palace of the warlord. Suspicion, therefore, did not fall upon Tul Akstar, and the ships of Helium scoured Barsoom for many months in vain search for Sanoma Tora. It was only by accident that Cal Tavan, the slave, who had overheard my conversation with the major domo, learned that the ships of Helium had not been dispatched to Jahar, for a slave ordinarily is not taken into the confidences of his master, and the arrogant Tor Hatan was of all men least likely to do so. But Cal Tavan did hear eventually, and he went himself to the warlord and told his story. "For his services," said John Carter, "I gave him his freedom, and as it was apparent from his demeanor that he had been born to the nobility in his native country, though he did not tell me this, I gave him service aboard the fleet. He has turned out to be an excellent man, and recently I have made him a dwar. Having been born in Janeth and served in Kobol, he was more familiar with this part of Barsoom than any other man in Helium. I therefore assigned him to duty with the navigating officer of the fleet, and he is now aboard the flagship." "I had occasion to notice the man immediately after Sanoma Tora's abduction," I said, "and I was much impressed by him. I am glad that he has found his freedom and the favor of the warlord." The cruiser that was to bear the flag of truce was now alongside. The officer in command reported to the warlord, and as he received his instructions, Tavia and I returned to the Jama. We had decided to carry on our part of the plan alone, for if it became necessary to abduct Tul Akstar again, I had hoped also that I might find Phao and Sanoma Tora, and if so, the small cabin of the Jama would be sufficiently crowded without the addition of the two Padwars. They were reluctant to leave her, for I think they had had the most glorious experience of their lives during the short time that they had been aboard her, but I gained permission from the warlord for them to accompany the cruiser to Jahar. Once again Tavia and I were alone. "Perhaps this will be our last cruise aboard the Jama," I said. "I think I shall be glad to rest," she replied. "You are tired?" I asked. "More tired than I realized until I felt the safety and security of that great fleet of Helium about me. I think that I am just tired of being always in danger." "I should not have brought you now," I said. "There is yet time to return you to the flagship." She smiled. "You know better than that, Hadron," she said. I did know better. I knew that she would not leave me. We were silent for a while as the Jama slid through the air slightly astern of the cruiser. As I looked at Tavia's face, it seemed to reflect a great weariness, and there were little lines of sadness there that I had not seen before. Presently she spoke again in a dull tone that was most unlike her own. "I think that Sanoma Tora will be glad to come away with you this time," she said. "I do not know," I said. "It makes no difference to me whether she wishes to come or not. It is my duty to fetch her." She nodded. "Perhaps it is best," she said. "Her father is a noble and very rich." I did not understand what that had to do with it, and not being particularly interested further in either Sanoma Tora or her father, I did not pursue the conversation. I knew that it was my duty to return Sanoma Tora to Helium if possible, and that was the only interest I had in the affair. We were well within the sight of Jahar before we encountered any warships, and then a cruiser came to meet ours which bore the flag of truce. The commander of the two boats exchanged a few words, and then the Jaharian craft turned and led the way toward the palace of Tal-Akstar. It moved slowly, and I forged on ahead, my plans already made, and the Jama, being clothed with invisibility, needed no escort. I steered directly to that wing of the palace which contained the women's quarters, and slowly circled it, my periscope on a line with the windows. We had rounded the end of the wing in which the great hall lay where Tal-Akstar held court with his women, when the periscope came opposite the windows of a gorgeous apartment. I brought the ship to a stop before it, as I had before some of the others which I wished to examine, and while the slowly moving periscope brought different parts of the large room to the ground-glass plate before me, I saw the figures of two women, and instantly I recognized them. One was Sanoma Tora, and the other Phao, and upon the figure of the former hung the gorgeous trappings of a Jadara. The woman I had loved had achieved her goal, but it caused me no pang of jealousy. I searched the balance of the apartment, and finding no other occupant, I brought the deck of the Jama close below the sill of the window. Then I raised a hatch and leaped into the room. At sight of me, Sanoma Tora arose from the divan upon which she had been sitting, and shrank back in terror. I thought that she was about to scream for help, but I warned her to silence, and at the same instant Phao sprang forward, and seizing Sanoma Tora's arm, clapped a palm over her mouth. A moment later I had gained her side. "The fleet of Jahar has gone down to defeat before the ships of Helium," I told Sanoma Tora, "and I have come to take you back to your own country." She was trembling so that she could not reply. I had never seen such a picture of abject terror, induced, no doubt, by her own guilty conscience. "I am glad you have come, Hadron of Hastor," said Phao, "for I know that you will take me too." "Of course," I said. "The Jama lies just outside that window. Come, we shall soon be safe aboard the flagship of the Warlord." While I had been talking, I had become aware of a strange noise that seemed to come from a distance, and which rose and fell in volume, and now would appear to be growing nearer and nearer. I could not explain it. Perhaps I did not attempt to, for at best I could be only mildly interested. I had found two of those whom I sought. I would get them aboard the Jama, and then I would try to locate Tal-Akstar. At that instant the door burst open, and a man rushed into the room. It was Tal-Akstar. He was very pale, and he was breathing hard. At sight of me he halted and shrank back, and I thought that he was going to turn and run, but he only looked fearfully back through the open door, and then he turned to me, trembling. "They're coming!" he cried in a voice of terror. "They will tear me to pieces!" "Who is coming?" I demanded. "The people," he said. "They have forced the gates, and they are coming. Do you not hear them?" So that was the noise that had attracted my attention, the hungry hordes of Jahar searching out the author of their misery. "The Jama is outside that window," I said. "If you will come aboard her as a prisoner of war, I will take you to the warlord of Barsoom." "He will kill me too," wailed Tal-Akstar. "He should," I assured him. He stood looking at me for a moment, and I could see in his eyes and the expression of his face the reflection of a dawning idea. His countenance lightened. He looked almost hopeful. "I will come," he said, "but first let me get one thing to take with me. It is in yonder cabinet." "Hasten," I said. He went quickly to the cabinet, which was a tall affair reaching from the floor almost to the ceiling, and when he opened the door it hid him from our view. As I waited, I could hear the crash of weapons upon levels below, and the screams and shrieks and curses of men, and I judged that the palace guard was holding the mob, temporarily at least. Finally, I became impatient. "Hasten, Tall Axtar," I called, but there was no reply. Again I called him, with the same result, and then I crossed the room to the cabinet, but Tall Axtar was not behind the door. The cabinet contained many drawers of different sizes, but there was not one large enough to conceal a man, nor any through which he could have passed to another apartment. Hastily I searched the room, but Tall Axtar was nowhere to be found, and then I chanced to glance at Sanoma Tora. She was evidently trying to attract my attention, but she was so terrified that she could not speak. With trembling fingers she was pointing toward the window. I looked in that direction, but I could see nothing. "What is it? What are you trying to say, Sanoma Tora?" I demanded as I rushed to her side. "Gone," she managed to say. "Gone." "Who is gone?" I demanded. "Tall Axtar." "Where? What do you mean?" I insisted. "The hatch of the Jama. I saw it open and close." "But it cannot be possible. We have been standing here looking—" And then a thought struck me that left me almost dazed. I turned to Sanoma Tora. "The cloak of invisibility?" I whispered. She nodded. Almost in a single bound I crossed the room to the window and was feeling for the deck of the Jama. It was not there. The ship had gone. Tall Axtar had taken it, and Tavia was with him. I turned back and crossed the room to Sanoma Tora. "Accursed woman!" I cried. "Your selfishness, your vanity, your treachery has jeopardized the safety of one whose footprints you are not fit to touch." I wanted to close my fingers upon that perfect throat. I yearned to see the agony of death upon that beautiful face. But I only turned away, my hands dropping at my sides, for I am a man, a noble of Helium, and the women of Helium are sacred, even such as Sanoma Tora. From below came the sounds of renewed fighting. If the mob broke through, I knew that we should all be lost. There was but one hope for even temporary safety, and that was the slender tower above the women's quarters. "Follow me," I said curtly. As we entered the main corridor, I caught a glimpse of the interior of the great hall where Tall Axtar had held court. It was filled with terrified women. Well they knew what the fate of the women of Ajedak would be at the hands of an infuriated mob. My heart went out to them, but I could not save them. Lucky indeed should I be if I were able to save these too. Crossing the corridor, we ascended the spiral ramp to the storeroom, where, after entering, I took the precaution to bolt the door. Then I ascended the ladder toward the trapdoor at the summit of the tower, the two women following me. As I raised the trap and looked about me, I could have cried aloud with joy, for circling low above the roof of the palace was the cruiser flying the flag of truce. I apprehended no danger of discovery by Jaharian warriors, since I knew that they were all well occupied below, those who were not fleeing for their lives. And so I sprang to the summit of the tower and hailed the cruiser in a voice that they might well hear above the howling of the mob. An answering hail came from the deck of the craft, and a moment later she dropped to the level of the tower roof. With the help of the crew, I assisted Phao and Sanoma Tora aboard. The officer in command of the cruiser stepped to my side. "Our mission here is fruitless," he said. "Word has just been brought me that the palace has fallen before the onslaught of a mob of infuriated citizens. The nobles have commandeered every craft upon which they could lay hands and have fled. There is no one with whom we can negotiate a peace. No one knows what has become of Tall Axtar." "I know," I told him, and then I narrated what had happened in the apartment of the Jadara. "We must pursue him," he said. "We must overtake him and carry him back to the warlord." "Where shall we look?" I asked. "The Jama may lie within a dozen sofads of us, and even so we could not see her." "I shall search for him, never fear, and some day I shall find him. But it is useless now to try and find the Jama. Let us return to the flagship of the warlord." I do not know that John Carter fully realized the loss that I had sustained, but I suspect that he did, for he offered me all the resources of Helium in my search for Tavia. I thanked him, but asked only for a fast ship. One in which I might devote the remainder of my life in what I truly believed would prove a futile search for Tavia, for how could I know where in all wide Barsoom Tall Axtar would elect to hide? Doubtless there were known to him many remote spots in his own empire where he could live in safety for the balance of his allotted time on Barsoom. To such a place he would go, and because of the Jama no man could see him pass. There would be no clue by which to follow him, and he would take Tavia with him, and she would be his slave. I shuddered, and my nails sank into my palms at the thought. The warlord ordered one of the newest and swiftest fliers of Helium to be brought alongside the flagship. It was a trim craft of the semi-cabin type that would easily accommodate 4 or 5 in comfort. From his own stores he had provisions and water transferred to it, and he added wine from Tarth and jars of the famous honey of Dusar. Sanoma Tora and Phao had been sent at once to a cabin by the warlord, for the deck of a man-of-war on duty is no place for women. I was about to depart when a messenger came saying that Sanoma Tora wished to see me. "I do not wish to see her," I replied. "Her companion also begged that you would come," replied the messenger. That was different. I had almost forgotten Phao, but if she wished to see me I would go, and so I went at once to the cabin where the 2 girls were. As I entered, Sanoma Tora came forward and threw herself upon her knees before me. "Have pity on me, Hadron of Hastor," she cried. "I have been wicked, but it was my vanity and not my heart that sinned. Do not go away. Come back to Helium, and I will devote my life to your happiness. Tor-Hatan, my father, is rich. The mate of his only child may live forever in luxury." I am afraid that my lips curled to the sneer that was in my heart. What a petty soul was hers! Even in her humiliation and her penitence she could see no beauty and no happiness greater than wealth and power. She thought that she was changed, but I knew that Sanoma Tora never could change. "Forgive me, Tanhadron," she cried. "Come back to me, for I love you. Now I know that I love you." "Your love has come too late, Sanoma Tora," I said. "You love another?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "The Jahar of some strange countries you have been through?" she asked. "A slave girl," I replied. Her eyes went wide in incredulity. She could not conceive that one might choose a slave girl to the daughter of Tor-Hatan. "Impossible," she said. "It is true, though," I assured her. "A little slave girl is more desirable to Hadron of Hastor than is Sanoma Tora, the daughter of Tor-Hatan." And with that I turned my back upon her and faced Phao. "Goodbye, dear friend," I said. "Doubtless we shall never meet again, but I shall see to it that you have a good home in Hastor. I shall speak to the warlord before I leave, and have him send you directly to my mother." She laid her hand upon my shoulder. "Let me go with you, Tanhadron," she said, "for perhaps while you are searching for Tavia you will pass near Jama." I understood instantly what she meant, and I reproached myself for having even temporarily forgotten Nur-An. "You shall come with me, Phao," I said, "and my first duty shall be to return to Jama and rescue Nur-An from poor old Fort Tak." Without another glance at Sanoma Tora, I led Phao from the cabin, and after a few parting words with the warlord, we boarded my new ship, and with friendly farewells in our ears, headed west toward Jama. Being no longer protected by the invisibility compound of Fort Tak or the disintegrating ray-resisting paint of Jahar, we were forced to keep a sharp lookout for enemy ships, of which I had but little fear if we sighted them in time, for I knew that I could outdistance any of them. I set the destination control compass upon Jama and opened the throttle wide. The swift Barsoomian night had fallen. The only sound was the rush of thin air along our sides, which drowned out the quiet purring of our motor. For the first time since I had found her again in the quarters of the Jahar at Jahar, I had an opportunity to talk with Phao, and the first thing I asked her was for an explanation of the abandonment of the Jama after Tul Akstar had grounded Tavia and me in Ugor. "It was an accident," she said, "that threw Tul Akstar into a great fit of rage. We were headed for Jahar when he sighted one of his own ships, which took us aboard as soon as they discovered the identity of the Jeddak. It was at night, and in the confusion of boarding the Jaharian warship, Tul Akstar momentarily forgot the Jama, which must have drifted away from the larger craft the moment that we left her. They cruised about searching for her for a while, but at last they had to give it up and the ship proceeded toward Jahar." The miracle of the presence of the Jama at the top of the peak, where we had so providentially found it in time to escape from the hunting men of Ugor, was now no longer a miracle. The prevailing winds in this part of Barsoom are from the northwest at this time of the year. The Jama had merely drifted with the wind and chanced to lodge upon the highest peak of the range. Feo also told me why Tul Akstar had originally abducted Sanoma Tora from Helium. He had had his secret agents at Helium for some time previous, and they had reported to him that the best way to lure the fleet of Helium to Jahar was to abduct a woman of some noble family. He had instructed them to select a beautiful one, and so they had decided upon the daughter of Tor Hatan. But how did they expect to lure the fleet of Helium to Jahar if they left no clue as to the identity of the abductors of Sanoma Tora? I asked. They left no clue at the time because Tul Akstar was not ready to receive the attack of Helium, explained Feo. But he had already sent his agents word to drop a hint as to the whereabouts of Sanoma Tora when John Carter learned through other sources the identity of her abductors. So it all worked out the way Tul Akstar had planned, I said, except the finish. We passed the hours with brief snatches of conversation and long silences, each occupied with his own thoughts. Feo's doubtless a mixture of hope and fear, but there was little room for hope in mine. The only pleasant prospects that lay before me lay in rescuing Nur-An and reuniting him and Feo. After that, I would take them to any country to which they wished to go, and then return to the vicinity of Jahar and prosecute my hopeless search. "I heard what you said to Sanoma Tora in the cabin of the flagship," said Feo after a long silence, "and I was glad." "I said a number of things," I reminded her. "To which do you refer?" "You said that you loved Tavia," she replied. "I said nothing of the kind," I rejoined rather shortly, for I almost loathed that word. "But you did," she insisted. "You said that you loved a little slave girl, and I know that you love Tavia. I have seen it in your eyes. You have seen nothing of the kind. Because you are in love, you think that everyone must be." She laughed. "You love her, and she loves you." "We are only friends, very good friends," I insisted, "and furthermore, I know that Tavia does not love me." "How do you know?" "Let us not speak of it any more," I said, but though I did not speak of it, I thought about it. I recalled that I had told Sanoma Tora that I loved a little slave girl, and I knew that I had had Tavia in my mind at the time, but I thought that I had said it more to wound Sanoma Tora than for any other purpose. I tried to analyze my own feelings, but at last I gave it up as a foolish thing to do. Of course I did not love Tavia. I loved no one. Love was not for me. Sanoma Tora had killed it within my breast, and I was equally sure that Tavia did not love me. If she had, she would have shown it, and I was quite sure that she had never demonstrated any other feeling for me than the finest of comradeship. We were just what she had said we were, comrades in arms, and nothing else. It was still dark when I saw the gleaming white palace of Fort Tack shining softly in the moonlight far below us. Late as it was, there were lights in some of the rooms. I had hoped that all would be asleep, for my plans depended upon my ability to enter the palace secretly. I knew that Fort Tack never kept any watch at night, feeling that none was needed in such an isolated spot. Silently, I dropped the flier until it rested upon the roof of the building where Nur-An and I had first landed, for I knew that there I would find a passage to the palace below. "Wait here at the controls, Feo," I whispered. "Nur-An and I may have to come away in a hurry, and you must be ready." She nodded her head understandingly, and a moment later I had slipped quietly to the roof and was approaching the opening that led down into the interior. As I paused at the top of the spiral ramp, I felt quickly of my weapons to see that each was in its place. John Carter had fitted me out anew. Once more I stood in the leather and metal of Helium, with a full complement of weapons such as belonged to a fighting man of Barsoom. My longsword was of the best steel, for it was one of John Carter's own. Beside this, I carried a short sword and a dagger, and once again a heavy radium pistol hung at my hip. I loosened the latter in its holster as I started down the spiral ramp. As I approached the bottom, I heard a voice. It was coming from the direction of Fortak's laboratory, the door of which opened upon the corridor at the bottom of the ramp. I crept slowly downward. The door leading to the laboratory was closed. 2 men were conversing. I could recognize the thin, high voice of Fortak. The other voice was not that of Nur-An, and yet it was strangely familiar. "Riches beyond your dream," I heard the second man say. "I do not need riches," cackled Fortak. "Hey-oh! Presently I shall own all the riches in the world." "You will need help," I could hear the other man say in a pleading tone. "I can give you help. You shall have every ship of my great fleet." That remark brought me up upstanding. Every ship of my great fleet. It could not be possible, and yet... Gently, I tried the door. To my surprise, it swung open, revealing the interior of the room. Beneath a bright light stood Tul Akstar. 50 feet from him, Fortak was standing behind a bench upon which was mounted a disintegrating ray rifle aimed full at Tul Akstar. Where was Tavia? Where was Nur-An? Perhaps this man alone knew where Tavia was, and Fortak was about to destroy him. With a cry of warning, I leaped into the room. Tul Akstar and Fortak looked at me quickly, surprise large upon their countenances. "Hi-oh!" screamed the old inventor. "So you have come back! Knave! Ingrate! Traitor! But you have come back only to die!" "Wait!" I cried, raising my hand. "Let me speak." "Silence!" screamed Fortak. "You shall see Tul Akstar die. I hated to kill him without someone to see, someone to witness his death agony. I shall have my revenge on him first, and then on you." "Stop!" I cried. His finger was already hovering over the button that would snatch Tul Akstar into oblivion, perhaps with the secret of the whereabouts of Tavia. I drew my pistol. Fortak made a sudden motion with his hands and disappeared. He vanished as though turned to thin air by his own disintegrating rays, but I knew what had happened. I knew that he had thrown a mantle of invisibility around himself, and I fired at the spot where he had last been visible. At the same instant, the floor opened beneath me, and I shot into utter darkness. I felt myself hurtling along a smooth surface, which gradually became horizontal, and an instant later I shot into a dimly lighted apartment, which I knew must be located in the pits beneath the palace. I had clung to my pistol as I fell, and now, as I rose to my feet, I thrust it back into its holster. At least I was not unarmed. The dim light in the apartment, which was little better than no light at all, I discovered came from a ventilator in the ceiling, and that, aside from the shaft that had conducted me to the cell, there was no other opening in the wall or ceiling or floor. The ventilator was about 2 feet in diameter and led straight up from the center of the ceiling to the roof of the building, several levels above. The lower end of the shaft was about 2 feet above my fingertips when I extended them high above my head. This avenue of escape, then, was useless, but alas, how tantalizing! It was maddening to see daylight, and an open avenue to the outer world just above me, and be unable to reach it. I was glad that the sun had risen, throwing its quick light over the scene, for had I fallen here in utter darkness, my plight would have seemed infinitely worse than now, and my first ancestor knew that it was bad enough. I turned my attention now to the chute through which I had descended, and I found that I could ascend it quite a little distance. But presently it turned steeply upward, and its smoothly polished walls were unscalable. I returned to the pits. I must escape. But now, as my eyes became accustomed to the dim light, I saw strewn about the floor that which snatched away my last hope and filled me with horror. Everywhere upon the stone flagging were heaps and mounds of human bones, picked clean by gnawing rats. I shuddered as I contemplated the coming of night. How long before my bones too would be numbered among the rest? The thought made me frantic, not for myself, but for Tavia. I could not die. I must not die. I must live until I had found her. Hastily I circled the room, searching for some clue to hope, but I found only rough-hewn stones set in soft mortar. Soft mortar. With realization, hope dawned anew. If I could remove a few of these blocks and pile them one on top of the other, I might easily reach the shaft that terminated in the ceiling above my head. Drawing my dagger, I fell to work, scraping and scratching at the mortar about one of the stones in the nearest wall. It seemed slow work, but in reality I had loosened the stone in an incredibly short time. The mortar was poor stuff and crumbled away easily. As I drew the block out, my first plan faded in the light of what I saw in front of me. Beyond the opening, I saw a corridor at the foot of a spiral ramp leading upward, and from somewhere above, daylight was filtering down. I knew that if I could remove 3 more of those stones before I was detected, I could worm my body through the opening into the corridor beyond, and you may well believe that I worked rapidly. One by one, the blocks were loosened and removed, and it was with a feeling of exultation that I slipped through into the corridor. Above me rose a spiral ramp. Where it led, I did not know, but at least it led out of the pits. Cautiously, and yet without any hesitation, I ascended. I must try to reach the laboratory before Fort Tak had slain Tol-Axtar. This time I would make sure of the old inventor before I entered the room, and I prayed to all my ancestors that I should be in time. Doors leading from the ramp to various levels of the palace were all locked, and I was forced to ascend to the roof. As it chanced, the wing upon which I found myself was more or less detached, so that at first glance I could see no way whereby I could make my way from it to any of the adjoining roofs. As I walked around the edge of the building hurriedly, looking for some means of descent to the roof below, I saw something one level below me that instantly charged my attention. It was a man's leg protruding from a window, as though he had thrown one limb across the sill. A moment later, I saw an arm emerge, and the top of a man's head and his shoulders were visible as he leaned out. He reached down and up, and I saw something appear directly beneath him that had not been there before, and at the same instant I caught a glimpse of a girl, lying a few feet further down, and then I saw the man slide over the sill quickly and drop down and disappear, and all that lay below me was the flagging of a courtyard. But in the brief instant I knew precisely what I had seen. I had seen Tol-Axtar raise the hatch of the Jama. I had seen Tavia lying bound on the floor of the ship beneath the hatch. I had seen Tol-Axtar enter the interior of the craft and close the hatch above his head. It takes a long while to tell it when compared with the time in which it actually transpired, nor was I so long in acting as I have been in telling. As the hatch closed, I leapt. End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17 of A Fighting Man of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. I find a princess. It would be as unreasonable to aver that I fully visualized the outcome of my act as I leaped out into space with nothing visible between me and the flagstones of the courtyard 40 feet below, as it would be to assume that I acted solely upon unreasoning impulse. There are emergencies in which the mind functions with inconceivable celerity. Perceptions are received, judgments arrived at, and reason operates to a definite conclusion, all so swiftly that the three acts appear simultaneous. Thus must have been the process in this instance. I knew where the narrow walkway upon the upper deck of the Jama must lie in the seemingly empty space below me, for I had jumped almost the instant that the hatch had closed. Of course, I know now, and I knew then, that it would have been a dangerous feat and difficult of achievement even had I been able to see the Jama below me. Yet, as I look back upon it now, there was nothing else that I could have done. It was my last chance to save Tavia from a fate worse than death. It was perhaps my last opportunity ever to see her again. As I jumped then, I should jump again under like conditions, even though I knew that I should miss the Jama. For now as then, I know that I should rather die than lose Tavia. Although then I did not know why, while now I do. But I did not miss. I landed squarely upon my feet upon the narrow walkway. The impact of my weight upon the upper deck of the craft must have been noticeable to Tall Axtar, for I could feel the Jama drop a little beneath me. Doubtless he wondered what had happened, but I do not think that he guessed the truth. However, he did not raise the hatch as I hoped he would, but instead he must have leaped the controls at once, for almost immediately the Jama rose swiftly at an acute angle, which made it difficult for me to cling to her, since her upper deck was not equipped with harness rings. By grasping the forward edge of the turret, however, I managed to hold on. As Tall Axtar gained sufficient altitude and straightened out upon his course, he opened the throttle wide, so that the wind rushing by me at terrific velocity seemed momentarily upon the point of carrying me from my precarious hold and hurtling me to the ground far below. Fortunately, I am a strong man. None other could have survived that ordeal, yet how utterly helpless I was. Had Tall Axtar guessed the truth, he could have raised the after hatch and had me at his mercy, for though my pistol hung at my side, I could not have released either hand to use it. But doubtless Tall Axtar did not know, or if he did, he hoped that the high speed of the ship would dislodge whoever or whatever it might have been that he felt drop upon it. I had hung there but a short time before I realized that eventually my hold must weaken and be torn loose. Something must be done to rectify my position. Tavia must be saved, and because I alone could save her, I must not die. Straining every thew, I dragged myself further forward, until I lay with my chest upon the turret. Slowly, inch by inch, I wormed myself forward. The tubular sheeting of the periscope was just in front of me. If I could but reach that with one hand, I might hope to attain greater safety. The wind was buffeting me, seeking to tear me away. I sought a better hold with my left forearm about the turret, and then I reached quickly forward with my right hand, and my fingers closed about the sheathing. After that, it was not difficult to stretch a part of my harness about the front of the turret. Now I found that I could have one hand free, but until the ship stopped, I could not hope to accomplish anything more. What was transpiring beneath me? Could Tavia be safe even for a brief time in the power of Tall Axtar? The thought drove me frantic. The Jama must be stopped, and then an inspiration came to me. With my free hand I unsnapped my pocket pouch from my harness, and drawing myself still further forward, I managed to place the opened pouch over the eye of the periscope. Immediately, Tall Axtar was blind. He could see nothing. Nor was it long before the reaction that I had expected and hoped for came. The Jama slowed down and finally came to a stop. I had been lying partially upon the forward hatch, and now I drew myself away from and in front of it. I hoped that it would be the forward hatch that he would open. It was the closer to him. I waited, and then glancing forward, I saw that he was opening the ports. In this way, he could see to navigate the ship, and my plan was blocked. I was disappointed, but I would not give up hope. Very quietly, I tried the forward hatch, but it was locked upon the inside. Then I made my way swiftly and silently to the after hatch. If he should start the Jama again at full speed now, doubtless I should be lost, but I felt that I was forced to risk the chance. Already the Jama was in motion again as I laid my hand upon the hatch cover. This time I was neither silent nor gentle. I heaved vigorously, and the hatch opened. Not an instant did I hesitate, and as the Jama leaped forward again at full speed, I dropped through the hatchway to the interior of the craft. As I struck the deck, Tulakstar heard me, and wheeling from the controls to face me, he recognized me. I think I never before beheld such an expression of mingled astonishment, hatred, and fear as convulsed his features. At his feet lay Tavia, so quietly still that I thought her dead, and then Tulakstar reached for his pistol and I for mine, but I have led a cleaner life than Tulakstar had. My mind and muscles coordinate with greater celerity than can those of one who has wasted his fiber in dissipation. Point blank I fired at his putrid heart, and Tulakstar, Jeddak, and tyrant of Jahar lunged forward upon the lower deck of the Jama, dead. Instantly I sprang to Tavia's side and turned her over. She had been bound and gagged, and for some unaccountable reason blindfolded as well, but she was not dead. I almost sobbed for joy when I realized that. How my fingers seemed to fumble in their haste to free her, yet it was only a matter of seconds ere it was done, and I was crushing her in my arms. I know that my tears fell upon her upturned face as our lips were pressed together, but I am not ashamed of that, and Tavia wept too and clung to me, and I could feel her dear body tremble. How terrified she must have been, and yet I knew she had never shown it to Tulakstar. It was the reaction, the mingling of relief and joy at the moment that the despair had been blackest. In that instant, as our hearts beat together and she drew me closer to her, a great truth dawned upon me. What a stupid fool I had been! How could I ever have thought that the sentiment that I entertained for Sanoma Tora was love? How could I ever believe that my love for Tavia had been such a weak thing as friendship? I drew her closer, if such were possible. "My princess," I whispered. Upon Barsoom, those two words, spoken by man to maid, have a peculiar and unalterable significance, for no man speaks thus to any woman that he does not wish for wife. "No, no," sobbed Tavia. "Take me, I'm yours, but I am only a slave girl. Hadron of Hastor cannot mate with such." Even then she thought only of me and my happiness, and not of herself at all. How different she was from such as Sanoma Tora. I had risked my life to win a clod of dirt, and I had found a priceless jewel. I looked her in the eyes, those beautiful, fathomless wells of love and understanding. "I love you, Tavia," I said. "Tell me that I may have the right to call you my princess." "Even though I be a slave?" she asked. "Even though you are 1,000 times less than a slave," I told her. She sighed and snuggled closer to me. "My chieftain," she whispered in a low, low voice. That, as far as Hadron of Hastor, is concerned, is the end of the story. That instant marked the highest pinnacle to which I may ever hope to achieve. But there is more that may interest those who have come thus far with me upon adventures that have carried me halfway around the southern hemisphere of Barsoom. When Tavia and I could tear ourselves apart, which was not soon, I opened the lower hatch and let the corpse of Tulakstar find its last resting place upon the barren ground below. Then we turned back toward Jama, where we discovered that earlier in the morning Nur-An had come to one of the roofs of the palace and been discovered by Phao. When Nur-An had learned that I had entered the palace just before dawn, he had become apprehensive and instituted a search for me. He had not known of the coming of Talakstar, and believed that the Jeddak must have arrived after he had retired for the night. Nor had he known how close Tavia had been, lying bound in the Jama close beside the palace wall. His search of the palace, however, had revealed the fact that Fort Tak was missing. He had summoned his slaves, and a careful search had been made, but no sign of Fort Tak was visible. It occurred to me then that I might solve the question as to the whereabouts of the old scientist. "Come with me," I said to Nur-An. "Perhaps I can find Fort Tak for you." I led him to the laboratory. "There is no use searching there," he said. "We have looked in 100 times today. A glance will reveal the fact that the laboratory is deserted." "Wait," I said. "Let us not be in too much of a hurry. Come with me. Perhaps yet I may disclose the whereabouts of Fort Tak." With a shrug he followed me as I entered the vast laboratory, and walked toward the bench upon which a disintegrating rifle was mounted. Just back of the bench my foot struck something that I could not see, but that I had rather expected to find there, and stooping I felt a huddled form beneath a covering of soft cloth. My fingers closed upon the invisible fabric, and I drew it aside. There, before us on the floor, lay the dead body of Fort Tak, a bullet hole in the center of his breast. "Name of Isis!" cried Nur-An. "Who did this?" "I replied. And then I told him what had happened in the laboratory as the last night waned. He looked around hurriedly. "Cover it up quickly," he said. "The slaves must not know. They would destroy us. Let us get out of here quickly." I drew the cloak of invisibility over the body of Fort Tak again. "I have work here before I leave," I said. "What?" he demanded. "Help me gather all of the disintegrating ray shells and rifles into one end of the room." "What are you going to do?" he demanded. "I am going to save a world, Nur-An," I said. Then he fell to and helped me, and when they were all collected in a pile at the far end of the laboratory, I selected a single shell, and returning to the rifle mounted upon the bench, I inserted it in the chamber, closed the block, and turned the muzzle of the weapon upon that frightful aggregation of death and disaster. As I pressed the button, all that remained in Jama of Fort Tak's dangerous invention disappeared in thin air, with the exception of the single rifle, for which there remained no ammunition. With it had gone his model of the Flying Death, and with him the secret had been lost. Nur-An told me that the slaves were becoming suspicious of us, and as there was no necessity of risking ourselves further, we embarked upon the flyer that John Carter had given me, and taking the Jama in tow, set our course toward Helium. We overtook the fleet shortly before it reached the twin cities of Greater Helium and Lesser Helium, and upon the deck of John Carter's flagship we received a welcome and a great ovation, and shortly thereafter there occurred one of the most remarkable and dramatic incidents that I have ever beheld. We were holding something of an informal reception upon the forward deck of the great battleship. Officers and nobles were pressing forward to be presented, and numerous were the appreciative eyes that admired Tavia. It was the turn of the dwar Kal Taven, who had been a slave in the palace of Tor-Hatan. As he came face to face with Tavia, I saw a look of surprise in his eyes. "Your name is Tavia?" he repeated. "Yes," she said, "and yours is Taven. They are similar." "I do not need to ask from what country you are," he said. "You are Tavia of Chaneth." "How do you know?" she asked. "Because you are my daughter," he replied. "Tavia is the name your mother gave you. You look like her. By that alone I should have known my daughter anywhere." Very gently he took her in his arms, and I saw tears in his eyes, and hers too, as he pressed his lips against her forehead, and then he turned to me. "They told me that the brave Tan Hadron of Hastor had chosen to mate with a slave girl," he said. "But that is not true. Your princess is in truth a princess, the granddaughter of a Jed. She might have been the daughter of a Jed had I remained in Chaneth." How devious are the paths of fate! How strange and unexpected the destinations to which they lead! I had set out upon one of these paths with the intention of marrying Sanoma Tora at the end. Sanoma Tora had set out upon another in the hopes of marrying a Jeddak. At the end of her path, she had found only ignominy and disgrace. At the end of mine, I had found a princess. End of Chapter 17. The End of A Fighting Man of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs.